there's got to be something about the people and what they believed at that time that made it a golden age. It's my belief that you have golden ages. Obviously, there are still external factors, like if there are natural disasters or, you know, a cold spell or something like that. Like you had, what was it, around the time sort of between the fall of the Roman Empire sort of and Attila, wasn't there massive global cooling? I mean, that really limited what people could do, because then all of a sudden agriculture was very much strained. And so you are bound to the circumstances of your time, but also the values and the virtues of the people at the time defines what makes a nation great, in my opinion. And that's part of the reason I was so keen to look at this, because this was the peak of the largest empire in history.
Yeah.
And so there's got to be something there and I personally think I draw a lot of I can trace a lot of my sort of values, my morals, my manners and etiquette to the Victorian era, because I think part of it might be because I've got quite an old family. Like my great grandparents were alive in the Victorian era, so I had sort of direct contact with my grandparents who would tell me about the lives of their parents. And so I've got basically secondhand accounts of the Victorian era. And obviously they would quite often, because I was young, tell me stories that would have some sort of moral twist to them that would reflect the values of the time. And so these sort of formative things shaped how I think. And I think for a lot of people, there's still that connection there, isn't there, of we've inherited these values to a certain extent. Some of them have trickled down, some of them haven't, but they still have an effect today. It's not like we've completely changed. There's this thread throughout history that has been continuous. And I think that's partly due to passing these sorts of things down through families. And I think it certainly depends on your family. It might not be the case for some and not others, but perhaps for those who are a bit more reflective about what their parents believe, what they believe, and what is good for, say, their children and grandchildren, they may well have been more inclined to pass these sorts of things on. And that's why they still have an effect today, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like my grandparents were sort of Edwardian, just about. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they would have been their parents. They would have been raised with sort of fully Victorian values, truly the real deal Victorian values. Yeah, no, absolutely. This is the thing I'm about to say now is a very broad point. But we live in the shadow of the Victorians, very, very directly, in a very, very real, direct way. There's a great book by Jeremy Paxman I read quite a few years ago called The Victorians. And I've read other things along the same lines, saying the same sorts of things, that the 20th century, because of course Victoria died in 1900 or 1901 or something. So just inside the 20th century. And the Edwardian period, her son, Edward, Bertie, Dirty Bertie, even in the World War I times, all the people that are adults in World War I era, their formative years would have been in the late Victorian times. So in a sense, you can say that even the first quarter of the 20th century is very, very Victorian in all sorts of ways. The Edwardian period is just an extension of the late Victorian period. And largely the Industrial Revolution, mostly, the main portion of it, happened or accelerated hugely during Victoria's reign. And the 20th century is, especially the first half of the 20th century, is very much, kind of obviously, just a continuation of the 19th century. So when you look back, when historians sort of look back again with a very broad stroke of the brush, you look back at the period before Victoria. If you look back at sort of the Regency period, again, George IV, the Prince Regent, you look back at the age of George III, he had a very, very long reign as well, very long, decades and decades and decades. When you look back at that period, it's sort of like a different world in all sorts of ways. And then you look at the Victorian world and it's almost modern. They're pretty much the same as us in loads of respects. So it's like there's a watershed moment in history. Yeah, we're just like almost like neo-Victorians in a way.
I think that's a good way of putting it, isn't it? Because
yeah. Loads of our values. I think especially, sorry, just one last thing to say, especially our values, just the way we look at the world, the way we think. The Victorians were modern in that sense. And we're just their inheritors.
Mm-hmm. I mean, everything you've said there, I think is very true. I think certainly for some people, you've got more of an inheritance than others in that it very much depends on where you grew up, who your family were, perhaps even which social class you belong to, because I've met many sort of upper class people, which I certainly don't count myself among. They live a very different life to me. They pretty much have a marked difference in how modern they are in the sort of post-World War II sense, in that they struck me more as almost being sort of true-blooded Victorians, but alive today, some of them, in that how they dressed, how they talked, the literature they read. There was a certain appreciation for that era, and I think that might be born of private schooling as well, in that it probably has a better focus on our golden age, and it's probably more patriotic because it's not filled with subversive left-wing teachers that want to undermine British greatness.
Yeah.
But moving on to another quote by Queen Victoria, and I wasn't really sure what to make of this one. It's, "The important thing is not what they think of me, but what I think of them." And this is, of course, in reference to her subjects.
Right. Okay.
So I don't really know what she's getting at there, and I wanted to kind of put it to you if you had an idea, really.
I've not heard that quote before, but what I would say, I think we said it in one of the last contemplations very briefly, just when you mentioned in passing that we might be talking about Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
And I said, I think she's a horrible person.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, she was extremely arrogant and pig-headed and rude and bullied all of her children mercilessly their whole lives. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah. That's horrible.
She was horrible to her own children in loads and loads of different ways. Yeah, and like deep into their adulthood. A few of them sort of broke away and eventually just had enough. But some of them never were able to. And she kept them under her thumb, browbeat them and was horrible to them. Lots of people say because her upbringing, her formative years, her childhood was crazily strict. Her mother, Queen Victoria's mother, was really horrible. She treated her daughter, Victoria, terribly. They brought her up in this, the fashion where just absolutely every moment of your life is observed, and there's like the strictest of rules about everything. That
sounds familiar.
But to sort of a crazy degree, or to what to our mind would seem a crazy degree. And so even in the 19th century, it was crazily old-fashioned and outdated way of doing things. But that's how she was raised. Mm-hmm. So she sort of tried to do something similar with her own kids, or just insisted on a very, very, very high level of formality at all times.
Mm-hmm. Because it's worth mentioning, I read chapters from Hartley in part 2 of the Manners and Etiquette. His notion of how to treat children is very different from what you're explaining there, in that he was saying, well, treat your children with kindness and they shall repay you in old age. You should delight in pleasing them. It should be what you kind of set out to do with your life, is to raise them into good people who you enjoy their company. And it was basically that notion. I thought that was lovely. I think, that's exactly what I'm probably going to do if I ever get around to it. But yeah, it's strange to think that the figurehead of the country was doing the complete opposite of that. And I think it does go to show that there is lots of variance in Victorian beliefs. It's not a uniform thing. Like, people talk of, in a conservative society, which I think is fair to say Victorians were socially conservative, weren't they? Certainly by modern standards.
Right. Yeah.
But they seem to talk about it like everyone just had the same opinion. And then there's social harmony because everyone agreed on everything. They were the same terms, and that's simply not true. There's social harmony because people appreciated social harmony for its own sake. That's why it was important. It was seen as an integral part of being polite and good-mannered. It wasn't because they all agreed. It was just that they had the good sense, if they did disagree, to approach it with a bit of integrity. And that's what we're lacking. It's not uniformity. It's individual integrity, basically, I think.
I mean, Queen Victoria certainly had that. She was true to her own rules. I think she was an extremely cold fish, shall we say. Extremely cold, humourless, famously very humourless. Sometimes I've seen one or two documentaries or like fictionalised drama things where they try to make out that she wasn't. But every real account I've ever heard is she was absolutely humourless. And of course she, after Albert died, she just spent the rest of her life, decades, in mourning. In black, yeah. Yeah, just didn't stop mourning Albert for 40 years or whatever it was. She had some funny ideas as well. Like, I've never seen that quote before, but I totally believe it. That's the sort of thing she would say. Like, she didn't believe in female suffrage, for example. I'm going to be getting onto that. Oh, okay. But no, we're going to be talking about suffrage at one point. So some of her views, or quite a lot of her views, again, to the modern mind, but even in her day, at the time, people were like, well, that's sort of overly straight-laced and formal and conservative and a bit, like, to the point of being a bit weird, a bit out of step with the times. But yeah, an interesting person, certainly an interesting person. I don't think we would enjoy her company, though. No. Well, I mean, she would view me as a commoner, right? She'd be looking down her nose at you at all times, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I've got to go very, very far back in my family history to have any claim to any titles, so... Yeah. But just because you're in the royal family, you don't have to do that. Like, for example, Bertie, her son, was famously affable. He was famously a great swell to be around. He'd throw parties all the time and be jovial and joking around and be very at ease with everyone, really, no matter what level of society you were from. So perhaps, quite possibly, probably, it seems, doesn't it, as a direct reaction to his mother. That can often be the case. Sometimes you can get children that are the polar opposite to their parents. And I know that my own father is a good case, not to get too personal, but, you know, he was raised in rural Scotland in kind of quite impoverished conditions and supposedly not very clean either. And he's very, very strict on cleanliness. So clearly his upbringing there basically poisoned him against being unclean. Like, it wasn't always the most fun growing up, because if I left like a teaspoon which had a little bit of tea on it, it would be like the end of the world. Just like, what are you doing, Josh? Standards are slipping. Who do you think you are, man? Oh, hell. No, it wouldn't be that strong. But yeah, being hyperbolic. I think quite often, well, you either just completely copy your parents, or you grow up as a reaction to them. I think you can also kind of be in the middle and pick and choose stuff, like, as long as you're a bit introspective about it, right? Yeah, yeah. I know, for example, again, without getting too personal about it, my father had a policy to never hit us. My mum didn't mind. My mum would slap the back of our legs or give us a thick ear or whatever, but nothing like a beating, nothing remotely close. Anyway, my dad would never hit us in any single way, shape or form. I think that's a really good thing. Because he had a relatively brutal, his father, World War II veteran, apparently there's stories of when he would beat the kids with a stick and stuff. So, you know, some people, they just take that and do that themselves with their own kids. And other people are like, well, I will never do that then. I know what that means, so I'm never going to... I'm very much in that latter camp, I think. Right, yeah. Well, yeah, it's a different world, isn't it? Well, yeah, I don't think all you do by hitting someone is make them resent you. Yeah, yeah, right. So you're not achieving any aims. It's actually just personal weakness, especially if you hit a child. If you fail to control a child and you hit them in retaliation, well, what does that say about you? But that was also common in the Victorian era, that sort of discipline. It's sort of almost martial in its nature, isn't it? It's like of course, martial punishments were physical as well at the time. Yeah. Like getting flogged, something like that. It's funny, actually, I don't want to spend too long on this sort of thing, but there's a story of when the Prince Regent, George IV, went to Eton, was educated at Eton, and even he, obviously the Prince of Wales, when he was naughty, they'd string him up by his ankles upside down and whip him.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So, the idea of corporal punishment, don't care if you're the Prince Regent of one of the biggest empires, or perhaps the biggest empire that has ever been. You're one heartbeat away from being the head of that. No, we shall whip you into shape. It's as simple as that. It's like, whoa, okay.
Well, there is a reason that whip someone into shape is a phrase, right? It comes from a literal background. Obviously, it's a metaphor now, or at least I hope so. But yeah, that's a really interesting anecdote. I'm amazed.
It is amazing.
You would have expected that they would arbitrarily punish one of their friends or something and make them feel even worse. I imagine that would be very effective. I know I would rather take the punishment myself if I was guilty than them punish one of my innocent friends, but that would be another way of doing it. I'm sure that did go on throughout history, didn't it? I hope you enjoyed that segment from Contemplations, my series. And if you want to watch the full conversation, which that was taken from, all you need to do is sign up to our website for £5 a month, and you can watch all of the content we have there. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.